He insulted her, belittled her case, and laughed in her face, until the agents in the back of the courtroom stood up and ended his career in seconds. Danielle Rhodes had been preparing for this moment for weeks. She sat in the Franklin County Courthouse, her hands resting on the table in front of her, fingers interlocked. Her attorney, Matthew Klein, whispered something reassuring, but she barely registered it. Her focus was on the man sitting high above, wearing the black robe that gave him unchecked authority in this room. Judge Warren Calloway. Calloway leaned back in his chair, adjusting his robe with an air of boredom. His reputation preceded him. Lawyers whispered about his temper, his biases, the way he ruled with an iron fist over his courtroom. Some called him unpredictable, others just called him dangerous. But today, for the first time in her life, Danielle was seeing him in action. And from the look in his eyes, he had already made up his mind about her case before she even said a word. The courtroom was eerily quiet as the bailiff called the case. Rhodes versus Merit Holdings, LLC. Danielle took a deep breath and stood, her heart pounding against her ribs. This wasn't just about an eviction. This was about her livelihood, her dignity. Her bookstore, page by page, had stood in the heart of downtown Lexington for the past 11 years. It wasn't just a business. It was a home for the community. She had poured everything into it, built relationships, hosted book clubs, hired local students, and even ran free literacy programs for kids. And now, Merit Holdings, a powerful real estate company with a long history of shady dealings, was trying to push her out. Their excuse? Structural violations that had mysteriously appeared only after she refused to sell. A building inspector had mysteriously found safety hazards in the property, none of which had ever been an issue before. The moment she started asking questions, the eviction notice landed on her desk. She knew exactly what was happening. They wanted her shop gone so they could turn the lot into yet another luxury condo project. She was the last tenant standing in the way of their plans. Her attorney began, his voice firm. Your Honor, my client has operated her business at this location for over a decade. The supposed code violations were only discovered after she declined multiple buyout offers from Merit Holdings. This is nothing more than a targeted effort to remove a long-standing, respected business owner under false pretenses. Judge Calloway sighed dramatically, flipping through the paperwork in front of him with little interest. Mr. Klein, let me stop you right there. Are you accusing a well-established property management company of lying? Because that's a pretty serious claim. Danielle's jaw clenched. Matthew remained composed. Your Honor, we're asking for a fair review of the evidence. The timeline of events speaks for itself. Calloway turned his gaze toward Danielle, finally acknowledging her presence. His eyes scanned her from head to toe, and the way his lips curled slightly made her stomach turn. He looked at her like she was an inconvenience, like she wasn't worth his time. You own a bookstore, correct? He asked, his tone dripping with condescension. Danielle nodded. Yes, Your Honor. A bookstore and community space. Calloway smirked. Community space? Is that what we're calling a failing business these days? A low murmur rippled through the small gallery behind her. Danielle gripped the table to steady herself. My business isn't failing, she said evenly. We've served this city for 11 years. Calloway exhaled sharply, shaking his head as if he had heard this all before. Miss Rhodes, let's be realistic. You want me to believe that a bookstore can hold off a legitimate real estate development in this economy? He scoffed. I think it's safe to say you're in over your head here. Danielle's nails dug into her palm. She wasn't some naive business owner who didn't understand how things worked. She had spent months fighting this, gathering evidence, speaking to attorneys. She had followed every rule, documented every shady move Merit Holdings had made. And yet, here she was, being spoken to like she was a child who didn't understand the world. Your Honor, Calloway waved a hand dismissively. I don't need a speech, Miss Rhodes. Let's cut to the chase. You're fighting an eviction from a company that has the legal right to remove you. This is a waste of the court's time. The frustration in the room was palpable. Danielle could feel the stares from the people seated behind her, some of whom had come specifically to support her. Her attorney wasn't giving up so easily. "Your Honor, we have documentation proving that these violations were fabricated. We have email correspondences, contractor statements, and a history of merit holdings targeting small business owners in the area." Calloway let out a low chuckle, flipping through the case file again. "Oh, please," he muttered, barely hiding his disdain. "This is a business dispute. You signed a lease and you got caught in a bad deal. That's life, and I highly doubt this company is sitting around plotting against you, Miss Rhodes." Danielle opened her mouth to respond, but before she could, Calloway leaned forward, resting his elbows on his desk. Then, with a slow, deliberate smirk, he said something that made the room go still. "You people love playing the victim, don't you?" The courtroom gasped. The stenographer, who had been steadily typing, hesitated for a split second before continuing. Matthew's expression darkened. Even the bailiff shifted uncomfortably. Danielle felt like the air had been knocked out of her lungs. She had known Calloway was corrupt. She had known he wasn't going to make this easy. But this was something else. But before she could respond, a subtle disturbance caught her attention. A movement near the back of the courtroom. Something was about to happen. The silence in the courtroom stretched longer than it should have. It wasn't just the words Judge Calloway had spoken, it was the way he said them. Casual, dismissive, like he had every right to. Danielle's fingers twitched at her side. Her throat felt tight, but she wouldn't give him the satisfaction of seeing her rattle. She met his gaze head-on. "Excuse me?" Her voice was steady, but the weight behind it was impossible to miss. Calloway leaned back in his chair, expression unreadable. "I said what I said." He gestured loosely in the air, as if this entire situation bored him. "You're dragging this out because you don't like the outcome. I see it all the time," the gallery murmured again, but Calloway ignored it. He was untouchable in this room. He knew it, and he reveled in it. Danielle's attorney Matthew took a slow breath, gripping the edge of the table. "Your Honor, let the record show that the court's neutrality has been compromised. That statement—" Calloway raised a hand. "Careful, counselor. Are you accusing me of bias?" "I'm saying," Matthew pressed, his voice like iron, "that a sitting judge making prejudicial statements in a legal proceeding should call into question the integrity of this ruling." Calloway scoffed, but Danielle caught it, the slight twitch in his expression. He didn't like being challenged. "You want to talk about integrity?" Calloway's voice darkened, the performative amusement slipping. "Miss Rhodes is behind on rent. The property owner wants her out. That's the law. If she didn't want to be evicted, she should have read the fine print before signing a lease." Danielle finally spoke, slow and deliberate. "I did read the fine print. I know my rights, and I know Merit Holdings fabricated those violations because I wouldn't take their payout." Calloway's lip curled. "Oh, come on. Businesses make deals all the time. If you'd been smarter, you'd have taken the money and walked away." Danielle let out a sharp breath through her nose. "Smarter?" "That's what I said." The room had turned into a pressure cooker. No one was even pretending to shuffle papers or check their phones anymore. All eyes were on Calloway. Matthew pushed forward. "Your Honor, if you refuse to consider the evidence, we will escalate this matter. I'll be filing a formal complaint with the State Bar and the Judicial Oversight Commission." Calloway exhaled heavily. "Oh, please. You think I haven't had complaints before? You think a bunch of paperwork is going to change anything?" He smiled, shaking his head. "You must be new at this." Danielle clenched her fists. He wasn't just corrupt. He was smug about it. He had probably done this to dozens, maybe hundreds of people before her. She was just the latest name on his docket. She took a slow breath, steadying herself. "I built my business from the ground up. I've worked hard for everything I have. And you're sitting there, laughing, telling me I should have taken a bribe? That I should have let a corporation push me out because it was easier?" Calloway shrugged. "It's how the world works, Miss Rhodes. You can be stubborn about it, but in the end, power wins. Always." The words sat heavy in the air. And then He smirked again. You people never learn. Another collective gasp rippled through the courtroom. This time, it was undeniable. Calloway had crossed a line so bold, so irreversible, that even the bailiff visibly tensed. Danielle felt her pulse hammer in her ears. But before she could say another word, something shifted in the room. A presence. From the back of the courtroom, the sound of a chair scraping against the floor broke through the tension. Someone was standing up. The scrape of the chair against the floor was sharp, cutting through the tension like a blade. Heads turned, eyes scanning the back of the courtroom. Two men in dark suits had risen from their seats. They weren't just any courtroom spectators. Their presence carried weight, shoulders squared, expressions unreadable, movements precise. Federal. Judge Calloway must have sensed it too, because for the first time since the hearing began, his smirk faltered. Just slightly. Danielle didn't dare to turn, but she could feel the shift in the room. The kind of silence that wasn't just about shock. It was anticipation. A moment waiting to tip over. One of the agents, a tall man with neatly cropped hair, stepped forward, clearing his throat. Your Honor, we need to speak with you. Calloway straightened, masking whatever flicker of unease might have passed through him. Excuse me. His voice had an edge now, the arrogant ease slipping. The agent held up a small leather wallet, flashing the badge inside. Agent Samuel Reyes, Department of Justice, my colleague and I need a word. A beat of silence. Then Calloway scoffed, regaining his composure. Unless you have immediate business before this court, you're interrupting an active hearing. The second agent, a woman with sharp eyes and a firm stance, took a step closer. Oh, we do. She glanced at the court reporter. Ma'am, please ensure this is entered into the record. The stenographer gave a stiff nod, hands hovering over the keys. Calloway's expression hardened. What exactly is this about? Agent Reyes didn't answer immediately. Instead, he reached into his suit jacket and pulled out a folded sheet of paper. He held it up deliberately, making sure the entire room could see it. A warrant. The courtroom gasped again, louder this time, a ripple of disbelief and fascination washing over the spectators. Even Danielle, who had walked in expecting the worst today, hadn't seen this coming. Matthew shifted beside her, whispering under his breath, This just got interesting. Calloway's jaw clenched. You better have a damn good reason for this. Agent Reyes unfolded the document and began reading. Your Honor, Warren Calloway, you are under federal investigation for multiple counts of bribery, case manipulation, and civil rights violations. We have substantial evidence indicating that you have engaged in unlawful judicial conduct, including taking financial incentives to dismiss or unfairly rule on cases involving corporate entities. Danielle's breath hitched. Calloway's grip on the bench tightened, his knuckles going pale. I have no idea what you're talking about, he said. But the usual bravado was cracking. The female agent stepped closer, lowering her voice just enough to turn it into a warning. We have recordings, Your Honor. Phone calls, emails, testimony from multiple sources, including attorneys who've worked under you. Calloway inhaled sharply through his nose. He was calculating now, trying to find a way out. Danielle could see the sweat forming at his temple. This is outrageous, he finally said, shaking his head. This is nothing but a political stunt. You can't just walk into my courtroom and... Agent Reyes cut him off. Your courtroom? He gave a pointed look around. Not anymore. The female agent pulled out another document. As of this moment, you are relieved of your judicial duties pending further investigation. A stunned silence filled the air. Even the bailiff, whose job was to enforce the judge's orders, looked momentarily lost. Calloway's lips parted, but no words came out. For the first time, he was speechless. Danielle felt something stir in her chest. Not joy, not relief, but something deeper, a shift. But just as she was processing it, the agents moved in closer. They weren't done yet. The room was frozen in place, like a moment caught in amber. No one dared to speak. No one even moved. Judge Calloway, always the most powerful man in this courtroom, was now the one under scrutiny. Agent Reyes took a step forward, the soft creak of his leather shoes somehow louder than anything else in the room. "Your Honor," he said, voice measured, almost clinical. "Please stand." Calloway let out a short, bitter laugh, the kind that barely masked the rage simmering underneath. "You've got some nerve walking in here like this. In my courtroom." But it wasn't his anymore, and everyone knew it. Danielle could see the fight happening behind his eyes. He wanted to argue, wanted to remind them who he was, what kind of influence he had. But even he wasn't stupid enough to resist federal agents in the middle of open court. "I have a docket full of cases," Calloway tried again, gripping the arms of his chair. "This is absurd." The female agent, still holding the suspension order, took another step forward. "Your cases will be reassigned." Her voice left no room for discussion. Calloway's face darkened, his mouth pressing into a thin line. The bailiff shifted uncomfortably near the judge's bench, waiting for some kind of order. But for the first time, Calloway had nothing to say. Agent Reyes nodded toward his partner. "Go ahead." And then, just like that, she pulled a pair of handcuffs from her belt. A fresh wave of gasps surged through the room. A judge being investigated was one thing, but a sitting judge, in handcuffs, in front of an open courtroom? Unheard of. Calloway jolted up from his chair. "Wait a damn second." Reyes was already moving, his stance firm. "Warren Calloway, you are under arrest. You have the right to remain silent. I know my rights." Calloway spat, his voice sharp. The female agent wasn't fazed. "Then you know resisting won't help you." A tense second passed. Then another. Calloway looked toward the bailiff as if expecting him to intervene, but the man just stood there, eyes downcast. The entire room had turned against him. Slowly his shoulders sagged. Agent Reyes didn't hesitate. He took one of Calloway's wrists, locking the metal around it. The click echoed in the silence. Then the other. Calloway clenched his jaw so tightly that a muscle in his cheek twitched. Danielle exhaled, feeling something deep in her chest shift, something she hadn't let herself hope for. Justice. Unbelievable. Calloway muttered under his breath, shaking his head. But what was really unbelievable was that he had gotten away with it for so long. Agent Reyes turned to the court reporter. "We'll need a full transcript of today's hearing." The stenographer, still clearly rattled, gave a quick nod. Danielle's attorney, Matthew, finally leaned in toward her, voice low. "Well, that wasn't on today's agenda." Danielle let out a short, disbelieving breath. "No, it wasn't." And yet, as Calloway stood there in cuffs, his face burning with humiliation, it felt like it was exactly what was supposed to happen. But the real question was, what else were they about to uncover? Calloway's breaths were heavy, his chest rising and falling with controlled rage. His hands, now cuffed in front of him, twitched slightly. He was used to control, of the courtroom, of people's lives, of the outcomes he decided before anyone even spoke. But not today. Agent Reyes nodded to his partner, who pulled out another document. This one was thicker, stapled, the pages worn from handling. She held it up, her voice steady. "These are the charges against you, Your Honor," Calloway scoffed, barely glancing at it. "Charges? What a joke!" Reyes didn't react. He flipped open a folder of his own, skimming the first page before reading aloud. "Multiple counts of bribery. Documented financial transactions in which you accepted payments in exchange for dismissing lawsuits against corporate entities." The crowd behind them stirred. A few people murmured. Some whispered in disbelief. Others, especially the ones who had dealt with him before, looked grimly satisfied. Reyes turned a page. "Tampering with evidence. Pressuring clerks and attorneys to discard or withhold evidence that would have ruled against certain financial backers." Calloway's jaw locked. "Discrimination in judicial rulings. A pattern of dismissing cases brought forth by marginalized business owners while expediting those filed by corporate firms." Danielle felt her stomach turn. She knew her case wasn't the only one, but hearing it confirmed that this was a pattern sent a wave of disgust through her. Calloway's eyes darted toward the gallery, as if searching for support. But there was none. Even the bailiff who had stood by him for years refused to meet his gaze. Agent Reyes flipped another page. And this is just the beginning. We have financial records, sworn testimonies, internal emails. Calloway cut him off, his voice sharp. This is garbage. Do you have any idea who I know? Reyes didn't blink. Yes, we do. Something shifted in Calloway's expression. It was quick, but Danielle caught it. He wasn't just angry. He was nervous now. The female agent folded her arms. We have a long list of people willing to testify against you. Some of them were in this very courtroom before, thinking they had no power to fight back. But now? She tilted her head slightly. Now they do. Danielle inhaled deeply, watching as Calloway absorbed that truth. It was over. He knew it. Everyone knew it. And yet, even in defeat, his pride wouldn't let him back down. He forced a dry chuckle, shaking his head. You think I'm the only judge who plays the game? You think I'm the only one pulling strings? Reyes raised an eyebrow. You think that helps your case? Calloway licked his lips, his confidence cracking, and for the first time, Danielle saw it. Fear. Not fear of the arrest, not fear of the cameras waiting outside, fear of losing everything. Reyes stepped back, motioning toward the courtroom doors. Take him. The bailiff hesitated, looking at Calloway like he was seeing him for the first time. Then, with a slow, resigned nod, he moved to escort him out. As Calloway passed Danielle, his eyes locked onto hers. For a split second, she saw pure hatred. But she didn't flinch. She had walked into this courtroom expecting to fight for her business, for her dignity, for her right to exist in the same space as those who had tried to push her out. Instead, she had watched a corrupt judge crumble under the weight of his own sins. The doors swung open, and Calloway was led away. But the fallout was just beginning. The heavy wooden doors swung shut behind Warren Calloway, but the weight of his downfall still lingered in the air. For the first time in years, his courtroom felt free, no longer suffocated by his unchecked power. Danielle let out a slow breath, her fingers finally unclenching from the edge of the table. She could feel the eyes on her, people whispering, still stunned by what had unfolded. Some looked at her with quiet respect, others with relief, as if they had been waiting for this moment longer than she had. Her attorney, Matthew, turned to her with an almost stunned expression. Well, he muttered under his breath. I'd say that worked out in our favor. Danielle exhaled a soft laugh, shaking her head. I don't even know what just happened, he smirked. Justice. The word sat heavy between them. Justice. A word she had chased for months, through meetings, legal filings, sleepless nights spent reading every clause in her lease, every loophole that Merit Holdings had tried to exploit. And yet her case wasn't even the reason Calloway had fallen. He had done this to himself, brick by brick, ruling by ruling, until the walls he had built to protect himself finally collapsed. The court reporter packed up her equipment, stealing one last glance at the empty judge's bench before shaking her head in disbelief. The bailiff, still standing near the exit, looked like a man whose entire world had shifted in a matter of minutes. Danielle turned toward the gallery. Some of the faces were familiar, other small business owners who had been fighting similar battles, who had come here today not just to support her, but to see if justice was even possible. For once, it was. The female federal agent, the one who had cuffed Calloway, approached Danielle, her expression unreadable. Miss Rhodes, she said in a calm, professional tone, if you're willing, we'd like to speak with you further about your case. There's a strong possibility you weren't the only business owner targeted. Danielle nodded slowly. Yeah, of course. Agent Reyes stepped beside his partner, slipping a card into Danielle's hand. You stood your ground, he said simply. Not a lot of people would have. Danielle swallowed hard, suddenly feeling the weight of it all settle over her. Not a lot of people could have, she admitted, because they don't have the time or the money to fight, because people like Calloway make sure they don't. The agent studied her for a moment before giving a slight nod. Well, now he's answering for it. She glanced at the business card in her hand. Department of Justice. Civil Rights Division. Danielle's grip on it tightened. This wasn't over. Her case would still go before another judge, and Merit Holdings would still try to push her out. But they had lost their inside man. And she? She had just won more than she ever expected. Matthew exhaled, rubbing the back of his neck. Do we still need to file that complaint? Danielle let out a tired laugh. I think someone beat us to it. A few people in the gallery chuckled under their breath, the tension in the room slowly dissipating. But as Danielle gathered her things, ready to step out of the courtroom, she realized something. This wasn't just about her store anymore. It never had been. It was about all the people who had been forced to stand in front of that bench, knowing the deck was stacked against them. It was about the ones who never got their chance to fight back. Calloway had spent years deciding people's fates, treating them as insignificant. And in the end, he was the one who walked out in handcuffs. She pushed open the courtroom doors, stepping into the crowded hallway. Outside, reporters were already swarming, cameras flashing, microphones being shoved in front of anyone who had been inside. Danielle took a breath, bracing herself. Because today wasn't just about what happened inside that courtroom. It was about what happened next. Corruption thrives when people believe they are untouchable. Warren Calloway thought his power would protect him, that his years of rigging the system would keep him above the law. But power unchecked always collapses. Danielle Rhodes stood her ground, not just for herself, but for every person who had been wronged before her. Sometimes justice takes time, but when it comes hard. If you believe in fairness, if you believe in standing up for what's right, let this be a reminder. Your voice matters. If you enjoyed this story, make sure to subscribe and turn on notifications so you don't miss the next one. Because stories like these, they deserve to be told.